In the winter of 1876, 3 months after the victory at Little Bighorn, a column of Lakota warriors under Crazy Horse moved north through the Powder River Basin. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Snow covered the ground to a depth of 18 inches. The U.S. Army's supply train, following behind, had lost 17 horses to the cold in a single night. The soldiers huddled around massive fires, burning entire lodgepole pines to stay warm, rotating in and out of the heat in shifts. By dawn, their fingers had turned black at the tips. 3 men had frostbite so severe they would lose sensation in their hands for the rest of their lives. Crazy Horse's camp, meanwhile, was silent. No fires burned. The warriors slept in groups of 4 or 5, wrapped in layered buffalo hides, their tipis positioned with the entrance facing southeast, away from the prevailing wind. When the Army scouts rode in at first light, expecting to find bodies, they found instead a camp of men moving methodically, checking their weapons, preparing to ride. Not one warrior showed signs of freezing. The Army's commander filed a report that day. It contained a single sentence that would haunt him. "They are not enduring this cold. They are defeating it." That phrase captures the central mystery. The soldiers were equipped with wool uniforms, issued by the federal government, designed specifically for winter campaigns. They had unlimited firewood. They had hot rations. They had a supply line stretching back to forts with heated barracks. And they were dying from the cold. The Lakota warriors had none of those things. They had buffalo hides, they had knowledge, and they survived. This was not luck. This was not toughness. This was a system, a set of interlocking principles built over generations, each one solving a specific problem that the cold presented. And when you understand how the system worked, you understand why the Army's approach failed so completely. So here's the question: how did Sioux warriors sleep through nights at 20 below zero without a fire to keep them warm? The answer wasn't that they were genetically adapted to the cold. It wasn't that they simply endured suffering better than other men. It wasn't even that they had access to some rare material unknown to the outside world. The answer was that they understood something about heat, about the human body, and about the physics of survival that the Army, for all its resources, had fundamentally misunderstood. And that understanding was built into every decision they made, from the moment they chose a campsite to the moment they lay down to sleep. This video breaks down that system into 6 interlocking layers. First, the choice of the campsite itself. Where you camp determines whether you're fighting the wind or using it. Second, the construction of the tipi, a structure that's not just a shelter, it's a heat management device. Third, the layering system for buffalo hides, each layer doing something different, nothing wasted. Fourth, the positioning of the body during sleep, a technique that sounds simple but requires understanding exactly how the human body loses heat. Fifth, the social structure of the camp, why warriors slept in specific groups of specific sizes. And sixth, the preparation that began months before winter ever arrived. And when the enemy finally understood this system, they didn't try to copy it. They destroyed the one thing it depended on. The Lakota, part of the larger Sioux confederation known as the Ochethi-Shakoving, or the 7 Council Fires, controlled the northern Great Plains from the early 1700s onward. Their territory stretched across 240,000 square miles. The grasslands and river valleys of what is now North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, and Wyoming. At the center of this territory lay the Black Hills, called Paha Sapa in Lakota, the sacred heart of their world. The name Sioux itself is a corruption given by rival tribes and French traders. It comes from the Ojibwe word Nadowesiu, meaning something like little snakes or enemies. The Lakota called themselves simply the people, and their language, their way of life, and their relationship to the land were inseparable from one another. For centuries before the arrival of horses, the Lakota hunted buffalo on foot, using the same principles of wind, terrain, and patience that would later define their winter survival system. But in the 1730s, horses began to move north from the Spanish settlements in the southwest, a consequence of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which had scattered Spanish livestock across the continent. Within 2 generations, the Lakota had become the dominant mounted warriors of the northern plains. They could hunt faster, they could trade farther, and they could wage war with a mobility that no other group in the region could match. By the 1850s, the Lakota were at the height of their power. They had defeated or displaced rival tribes. They controlled the buffalo herds, and they had developed a way of life so perfectly adapted to the environment that they could move through it in any season, even the harshest winters, with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural to the outsiders who encountered them. But that confidence was not magic, it was knowledge. The first decision made before the teepee was even raised was where to camp. A soldier looking at the landscape in winter saw only difficulty. Snow, wind, exposed ground, no shelter. The instinct was to find a ravine or a valley where the wind was blocked. The Army's winter camps were typically placed in low-lying areas, in the lee of hills, where the cold air pooled and the wind was absent. This was exactly wrong. The Lakota understood something that seems counterintuitive. Wind is not your enemy in extreme cold. Wind carries moisture. Wind can strip away the insulating layer of warm air that surrounds your body. But wind also moves air, and moving air prevents the formation of frost inside your shelter. The Lakota chose campsites on high ground, on ridges and open plateaus where the wind moved freely. A camp on the Powder River in January 1877 was positioned on a rise overlooking the valley, fully exposed to the prevailing northwest wind. The soldiers observing from a distance thought the warriors must be mad. Why would anyone camp where the wind could reach them? The answer lay in what happened inside the teepee. When you have a fire burning inside an enclosed space, the fire consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, water vapor, and carbon monoxide. In a sealed shelter, that vapor condenses on the interior surfaces, on the hides, on the ground, on anything cold enough to collect it. That moisture then freezes. Over the course of a night, a teepee with a fire burning inside can accumulate a layer of ice on its interior walls. That ice is a problem. When the temperature drops below freezing, ice is a conductor of cold. It draws heat out of the shelter and radiates it back in. But a teepee positioned in the wind, with an entrance that faces away from the prevailing wind direction, creates a natural ventilation system. The wind doesn't enter the teepee directly. The entrance is angled, and the structure of the teepee itself breaks the wind's force. Instead, the wind creates a pressure differential. Warm, moist air inside the teepee rises toward the smoke hole at the top. The pressure of the outside wind helps push that air out. Fresh, dry air enters slowly through the gaps in the hide covering and the base of the teepee. The result is a gentle, constant circulation of air. No condensation, no ice, and the air inside stays breathable. This was not accidental. The Lakota had positioned their teepees this way for generations. The principle was embedded in the culture. Always face the entrance southeast, away from the winter wind. Always camp on high ground. Always choose a site where the wind will move freely around you. The soldiers, meanwhile, built their winter camps in valleys and ravines. They sealed their tents as tightly as possible to keep out the wind. By the second night, the interior of a sealed tent was running with condensation. By the third night, the walls were coated with ice. The ice radiated cold. The men inside were colder than they would have been in an open field. The Lakota teepee was built on a 3-pole foundation, 3 long lodgepole pines, each roughly 25 feet in length, lashed together at the top and spread out at the base to form a tripod. Around this frame, 14 to 17 additional poles were leaned, creating a cone shape. The base diameter was typically 12 to 18 feet for a warrior's teepee. slightly larger for a family shelter. The covering was made from buffalo hides, sewn together with sinew and stretched tight over the frame. A typical teepee required 12 to 15 hides, depending on the size. Each hide was prepared by scraping away the hair and the subcutaneous fat, then smoking it to preserve it and make it water-resistant. The result was a material that was surprisingly thin, roughly the thickness of heavy leather, but extraordinarily durable. The genius of the teepee was not in any single element. It was in how the elements worked together. The conical shape is aerodynamically efficient. Wind flows around it rather than pushing against it with full force. The three-pole foundation distributes the weight of the covering evenly, and the additional poles create a lattice that's flexible enough to move slightly in the wind without collapsing. The smoke hole at the top is not just for ventilation, it's a temperature regulator. When the fire inside burns hot, the smoke rises and exits through the hole. As the fire dies down, the hole can be partially closed by adjusting the flaps on either side, which slows the escape of warm air without creating a seal. But the most important feature was one that the soldiers didn't understand until they had suffered through enough winters to learn it: the interior lining. Inside the teepee, hung from the poles at a height of about 5 to 6 feet, was a second layer of hide called the dew cloth, or lining. This created an air gap between the outer covering and the inner lining, a gap of roughly 2 to 3 feet in width, running around the entire interior of the teepee. This air gap was the key to the entire system. Here's how it worked. The outer covering of the teepee was exposed to the outside temperature and the wind. In extreme cold, that covering would be at or below the freezing point. Any warm, moist air that touched it would condense and freeze. But that air never touched it directly. Instead, the warm air from inside the teepee rose, hit the inner surface of the dew cloth, and was blocked. The dew cloth itself became cold. It was in contact with the outer covering after all. But it was not cold enough to freeze the moisture in the air. The moisture condensed on the dew cloth, which was fine. The dew cloth could be wrung out in the morning, or the moisture could simply drain down to the base of the teepee, where it ran out onto the ground. The outer covering, meanwhile, remained dry, and a dry hide, even at 20 below zero, retains its insulating properties. A wet or frozen hide becomes a conductor of cold. The air gap itself also functioned as an insulator. Still air is one of the best insulators available in nature. The gap between the outer covering and the dew cloth created a buffer of still air that slowed the transfer of heat from inside the teepee to the outside environment. The result was a structure that could maintain a temperature inside of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the outside temperature was 20 below zero, with nothing but a small fire burning. A fire just large enough to cook with, not large enough to heat the entire space. The soldiers' canvas tents, by contrast, were single-layer structures. They conducted cold directly. In extreme temperatures, canvas becomes brittle. It tears easily, and it offers almost no insulation. A soldier in a canvas tent in 20 below weather needed a fire large enough to heat the entire interior. A fire that consumed enormous amounts of wood and still left the men cold. But the teepee itself was only half the system. The other half was what you wore and what you slept in. A Lakota warrior in winter wore multiple layers of buffalo hide. The innermost layer was a robe made from a hide with the hair still on, worn with the hair facing inward against the skin. The hair trapped air, millions of tiny pockets of still air, the same principle as the air gap in the teepee. A single buffalo robe could provide insulation equivalent to a modern sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to zero. But a single robe was not enough for 20 below. The warrior wore a second robe over the first, again with the hair facing inward. The two robes together created two separate insulating layers, with a thin gap of air between them. Each robe was roughly 8 to 10 pounds of hide and hair. Two robes together weighed about 18 pounds. Over the robes, for additional protection and to keep the wind from penetrating the hair, the warrior wore a third layer, a hide covering without the hair, sewn to fit loosely over the robes. This outer layer was treated with fat and smoke, making it water-resistant and windproof. It was not meant to insulate. It was meant to protect the insulation underneath from the wind and from moisture. This three-layer system, inner robe, outer robe, windproof covering, was not unique to the Lakota. Many northern tribes used similar systems. But the Lakota had refined it to a degree that was remarkable. The hides were selected carefully. A robe made from a winter hide, taken in January or February when the buffalo's coat was at its thickest, was worth 2 robes made from a summer hide. The selection and preparation of the hides was a skill passed down through families. A woman who was skilled at hide preparation was a valuable member of the community because the quality of the hides directly determined the survival of the warriors. The layering system worked because each layer did something different. The inner robe provided the primary insulation. The outer robe provided a second layer of insulation, and the air gap between the 2 robes prevented the inner robe from being compressed by the outer layer. Compression destroys the insulating properties of hair. The windproof covering prevented convective heat loss, which is the loss of heat caused by wind stripping away the layer of warm air that surrounds the body. A soldier in a wool uniform, by contrast, wore a single thick layer. Wool is an excellent insulator, but it has a critical weakness. It absorbs moisture. In the extreme cold of the northern plains, that moisture freezes. A frozen wool uniform becomes a conductor of cold rather than an insulator. The soldier's body heat melts the ice closest to the skin, but the ice farther out remains frozen, and it pulls heat away from the body continuously. When night fell and the warriors prepared to sleep, they did not simply wrap themselves in their robes and lie down. There was a specific technique, refined over generations, for how to position the body to minimize heat loss. The Lakota warrior slept on his side, not on his back. This position reduces the surface area of the body that's exposed to the cold air. When you lie on your back, your entire front side is exposed. When you lie on your side, you reduce that exposed surface by roughly 30%. The warrior drew his knees up slightly, creating a position called the fetal position, a position that further reduces exposed surface area. The arms were kept close to the body, not extended outward. The head was tucked down, with the chin close to the chest to protect the face and neck from the cold air. But the critical element was the positioning relative to other warriors. Warriors did not sleep alone. They slept in groups of 4 or 5, arranged in a specific pattern. The group would lie on their sides, facing inward, their bodies forming a rough circle or oval. The warriors on the outside of the circle, the ones whose backs were exposed to the cold, would rotate positions during the night. After 2 to 3 hours, the outside warrior would move to the inside of the circle, and another warrior would take the exposed position. This rotation system meant that no single warrior spent more than a few hours in the coldest position. More importantly, the warriors in the center of the group benefited from the radiant heat of the bodies around them. A human body in a resting state produces roughly 100 watts of heat, equivalent to a bright light bulb. In a group of 5 warriors, that's 500 watts of heat being generated continuously. In the enclosed space of a tipi, with the dew cloth trapping the warm air, that heat accumulates. The soldiers, by contrast, typically tried to sleep as close to the fire as possible, and they slept as individuals or in pairs. The fire provided heat, but only to one side of the body at a time. The other side remained exposed to the cold air of the tent, and when the fire burned down, as it inevitably did in the middle of the night, the soldiers would wake up shivering and have to get up to feed the fire more wood. The Lakota warriors, sleeping in their groups, maintained a steady temperature throughout the night without any external heat source at all. The group sleeping arrangement was not just a practical solution to the problem of staying warm. It was embedded in the social structure of the Lakota camp. Warriors trained together. They hunted together. They went to war together. And they slept together in the same groups, night after night, winter after winter. A group of 5 warriors might have slept together for years, developing a rhythm and a familiarity that made the rotation system work smoothly, without discussion or coordination. When it was time to rotate, the outside warrior simply moved, and the inside warrior shifted outward. No one had to be told. This was not accidental. The Lakota understood that survival in extreme conditions depends on trust and coordination. A warrior who was not part of an established group, who did not know the other men he was sleeping with, would be far more vulnerable. He would not trust the rotation system. He would be anxious about his position in the group. And anxiety burns calories and generates stress, which further compromises the body's ability to retain heat. The soldiers, by contrast, were often separated from their regular units in winter camps. A soldier from one company might be assigned to tent duty with men from another company. Men he did not know well. There was no established rhythm, no trust. The result was that soldiers often refused to rotate positions near the fire, leading to conflict and resentment. Some soldiers would hoard the warmest spot and prevent others from getting close to the heat. This created a situation where some men were freezing while others were too hot, and no one was comfortable. The Lakota system, by contrast, was based on the principle that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's cooperation. The group sleeping arrangement enforced that principle every single night. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. But none of this system would have worked without preparation that began months before winter arrived. In the spring and early summer, as the buffalo herds moved north, the Lakota hunted selectively. They did not hunt for immediate consumption alone. They hunted for the hides they would need in winter. A hide taken in June, when the buffalo's winter coat was just beginning to grow in, was not useful for winter robes. But a hide taken in January or February, when the coat was at its thickest, was exactly what was needed. This meant that the Lakota had to plan ahead. They had to know in the spring what they would need in the winter. They had to hunt more than they needed for immediate consumption, preserve the meat, and store the hides in a way that would keep them in good condition for months. The preservation of meat was done through a process called pemmican making. The meat was dried in the sun, then pounded into a powder, then mixed with fat and berries and stored in hide containers. Pemmican could last for years without spoiling. A warrior going on a winter campaign would carry pemmican, a concentrated source of calories that provided sustained energy without requiring cooking. The preparation of hides was even more critical. A hide had to be scraped, treated with fat, and smoked. The smoking process, done over a slow fire, preserved the hide and made it water-resistant. A hide that was not properly smoked would absorb moisture and become brittle in the cold. A hide that was properly smoked would remain supple and insulating even at 20 below zero. This preparation work was typically done by the women of the tribe, but it was not separate from the survival system. It was central to it. A warrior's survival in winter depended directly on the quality of the work done by the women who prepared his robes and his pemmican. The soldiers, by contrast, had supplies shipped to them from distant forts. The supplies were often inadequate. The wool uniforms were issued in standard sizes that did not fit everyone. The food was often hard tack and salt pork, which provided calories but not the kind of sustained energy that pemmican provided. And the supplies often arrived late, or not at all. A soldier in a winter camp might go weeks with inadequate food and inadequate clothing, simply because the supply line had been disrupted. By 1876, the U.S. Army had learned enough about Lakota warfare to know that they could not defeat the warriors in direct combat. Crazy Horse had proven that at Little Bighorn. The Army could not match the warriors' skill with horses, their knowledge of the terrain, or their ability to move quickly and strike with precision. So the Army changed its strategy. Instead of trying to defeat the warriors in battle, they decided to destroy the system that kept the warriors alive. The buffalo herds had already been decimated by hide hunters. In 1860, there were an estimated 30 million buffalo on the Great Plains. By 1875, that number had dropped to fewer than 1 million. By 1880, there were fewer than 300 buffalo left in the entire northern plains. Without buffalo, the Lakota could not make robes. Without robes, they could not survive the winter. Without the ability to survive the winter, they could not wage war. This was not an accident. General Philip Sheridan, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, explicitly stated that the destruction of the buffalo herds was a military strategy. In a report to Congress, he wrote, "For the sake of lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated." The last major buffalo hunt by the Lakota took place in 1877. By 1880, the buffalo were gone. The robes that had kept warriors alive through 20 below winters could no longer be made. The pemmican that had sustained them on long campaigns could no longer be prepared. The Lakota were forced onto reservations where they were issued wool blankets and canvas tents. The very materials that had proven inadequate for survival in extreme cold. The system that had been refined over generations was destroyed, not by military defeat, but by the destruction of the resource it depended on. In the winter of 1890-1891, the first winter after the Wounded Knee Massacre, Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Reservation died of cold and starvation at rates that would have been unthinkable just 15 years earlier. The knowledge of how to survive the winter was still there. The people still remembered the techniques, the layering system, the group sleeping arrangement. But without buffalo hides, without the ability to prepare the robes that made the system work, the knowledge was useless. Today, if you look at how modern survival instructors teach people to survive in extreme cold, you'll see the Lakota system reflected in nearly every principle they teach. The concept of layering, an inner insulating layer, a middle moisture wicking layer, an outer windproof layer, is now standard in every cold weather survival manual. The principle of sleeping in groups, of huddling together to share body heat, is taught in military survival schools and wilderness courses. The idea of positioning a shelter to take advantage of wind rather than blocking it is now understood in terms of thermodynamics. But the principle is the same one the Lakota understood without needing the scientific vocabulary. When you buy a modern sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, you're buying something that works on the same principle as a Lakota buffalo robe. Trapped air in the insulation, a water-resistant outer shell, and a design that minimizes surface area exposure. The sleeping bag is a technological refinement of something the Lakota had already solved. The group sleeping arrangement is now taught in survival courses as communal sleeping or huddling, and it's recommended for anyone in extreme cold conditions. The rotation system is described as a way to ensure that no single person is exposed to the worst conditions for too long. The principle is identical to what the Lakota warriors practiced 400 years ago. Today, the Lakota people live on multiple reservations across the northern plains. The largest are Pine Ridge in South Dakota, with approximately 18,000 enrolled members, Rosebud, with approximately 10,000 enrolled members, and Standing Rock, shared between North and South Dakota, with approximately 8,500 enrolled members. The buffalo are gone, but the people remain. The traditional way of life has changed, but the knowledge has not been lost. Lakota elders still teach the principles of survival, still pass down the stories of how the ancestors survived the winters. Young people are learning again how to prepare hides, how to understand the relationship between the body and the cold, how to think about survival not as individual endurance, but as a system built on trust and cooperation. The system that kept warriors alive at 20 below zero was not a product of genetic adaptation or superhuman toughness. It was a product of careful observation, practical engineering, and generations of accumulated knowledge. It was a system that worked because every element of it, the campsite, the teepee, the layering of hides, the sleeping position, the group arrangement, the preparation cycle, was designed to solve a specific problem. And the fact that the system was destroyed does not mean it was wrong. It means that the people who built it understood something about survival that their enemies had to learn through suffering and death. If you want to see how another group of warriors used the landscape itself as a weapon against an empire that tried to conquer them, that video is on screen now.